Okay, YouTube. Well, I long wanted to get started on this. I haven't really got the time, but accompanied with me reading of this book called Who Built the Moon, and the pictures, of course, is pictures of the moon. And just to refresh your memory, each frame of pictures is 4,004.21 square miles. So it's a big area, very big area. Latitude in miles is 89.3, longitude in miles is 44.84, and the degrees for the latitude is 4.74 and longitude is 2.48. So it's some pretty big pictures, and the pictures are from the 90s, from the Clementine mission, and they are in HD quality, of course. But this book is written by Christopher Knight, the co-author of the best-selling The Hierarchy, and Alan Butler, who is author of the best-selling Civilization 1. And a little history about these two guys. Christopher Knight has worked as an advertising and marketing for over 30 years, specializing in consumer psychology and market research. His writing career began almost by accident after he had invested 7 years conducting research into the origins of Freemasonic rituals. He has written 4 books to date, co-authored with Robert Lomas. His first book, The Hierarchy, was published in 1996, and it immediately went to the UK top 10 seller list and remained in the chart for 8 consecutive weeks. It has since been translated into 37 languages and sold over 1 million copies worldwide, becoming a bestseller in several countries. He now divides his time between marketing, consultancy, and historical research for writing books. And Adam Butler is qualified as an engineer, but was always fascinated by history and made himself into something of an expert in astrology and astronomy. Since 1990, he's been researching ancient cultures, pagan beliefs, and comparative religion, and has published 4 successful books such as topics of the Knights Templar and the Grail legend. He's also published playwright and a very successful radio dramatist. So that was a little about who they are. And the contents of this book is quite extensive. There's 255 pages of information about what the moon is. So let's just go into the introduction first, and then just get on with it. Okay, and the dedication for this book is for my mother, my brother Peter, and in the loving memory of my father, C.K., for my good friends Henry and Michelle, A.B. So, introduction. For most people, the suggestion that the moon could be artificial is about as sensible as saying that it was made of green cheese. This is a perfectly reasonable response based on everything that we know about the world we live in, where there are just 2 kinds of objects. Those are here because of the random forces of the universe that we call nature, caused them to exist, or because they were manufactured by human hand. However, super rational our scientific community considered itself to be, are still huge numbers of people who believe things that are not proven by empiric means. In a recent poll was found that no less than 92% of Americans said they believe in God, and other surveys indicate that many millions of people are equally convinced that aliens has visited our planet. God may well exist, and to and so too might aliens for all we know. But this book will only concern itself with hard scientific fact, and unlike so many others trapped in the political correct world of academia, and our published findings will not be constrained by demands of current convention. The information we put forward here is clear, testable, we believe irrefutable. Despite the fact the moon is almost certainly 4.6 billion years old, we will demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt that Earth-Moon cannot be a natural object, and then we shall explain in detail how the agency that manufactured the moon left a series of detailed messages of what has been done and who and for whom it had been undertaken. So here's our challenge. Put aside your natural incredulity and read this book with an open mind. So I ask you to be open-minded here. If you can, but you will probably vehemently protest the contents of this book, but that's up to you. I don't choose for you. All I'm going to do is read. And maybe some of it will ring a bell, hit home. Okay, check out the evidence, then ask yourself who built the moon. We have cited 3 possibilities, but maybe you can think of more. However, the last of our suggestions appears to us to be increasingly likely, and is a worrying, staggering, exciting, and completely awesome concept. And if there is even an outside chance that this could be the answer, the world has a major new challenge ahead of it. So, that's the introduction. They're asking you just to have an open mind and just listen. So chapter 1 is the dawn of awareness. That's chapter 1's title. The entire population appeared to have simultaneously decided to evacuate every building, and the streets and car parks were quickly filling, with people standing almost shoulder to shoulder. Traffic began to grind at a halt as drivers leaned out of their windows, and even the birds abandoned the sky to assemble in rows along guttering and telephone wires, chattering like some misplaced dawn chorus. The large grey clouds obliquely parted to reveal a muted late morning sun that had a small bite outfit at its right-hand edge. As the dark spot grew, the birds fell silent, and the sea of expectant faces became transfixed upwards. 3 welders from a nearby garage became instantly popular as they passed around their dark-lensed mast, allowing the smiling onlookers a direct view of the diminishing solar disk. Then it happened. The moment of totality arrived. The sun disappeared for several seconds, allowing the darkness of night to wholly consume the day. Then slowly a bright sparkle materialized, and soon it looked like a diamond set on a band of some heavenly ring. At last the solar eclipse of the 20th century had just occurred on the morning of August 11, 1999. It had begun when the moon passed between the Earth and the Sun, throwing an umbral shadow 49 kilometers wide in the North Atlantic just south of Nova Scotia. The inky black circle then swept across the ocean's surface until it passed over the Isle of Sicily off the southwest coast of England. Or Scilly, not Sicily, not Italy, but the Scilly of the southwest coast of England, some 40 minutes later. Here the path, the width, expanded to 103 kilometers, as we're now covering the ground at a speed approaching 1,000 meters per second. The circular shadow then curved its way over Europe or into the Middle East before crossing India and finally disappearing over the Bay of Bengal. Such events do not happen often in a lifetime of an individual, but once seen, a total solar eclipse is never forgotten. Solar eclipses occur around 2 to 5 times per year, but the area of the ground covered by the totality is very small, meaning they're probably over the ocean, so we won't see it. So in any given location on Earth, the total solar eclipse will only happen once every 360 years. One can only imagine how primitive people may have feared for their life as the sun was apparently extinguished before their eyes. No doubt the astronomer priest in the ancient time held sway over their people by having the apparently magic power in predicting such terrifying events. But even today the magic and mystery of eclipse is very real. It is a very strange quirk of fate, indeed, that the disk of the moon should seem, from an earthly perspective, to be exactly the same size as the sun, whilst we casually take it for granted that the two main bodies seen in Earth's skies look the same size. It is actually something of a miracle. Most people are fully aware of the moon is a tiny compared to the sun, but it is much closer to us, causing them to appear as equal disks. To be precise, the moon is 400 times smaller than the star at the center of our solar system. Yes, it is actually 1/400th of the distance between the Earth and the Sun. Did you notice that? 400. Whilst the surprisingly neat number of 400 for relative size and distance is apparently an amusing coincidence to the decimal counting system, the odds against this optical illusion happening are all huge. Experts are deeply puzzled over the phenomena. Isaac Asimov, who was a Russian science fiction author, the respected, it says here, science fiction guru, described this perfect visual alignment as being the most unlikely coincidence imaginable. This perfect fit of the lunar and solar disk is a very human perspective because it is only works from the viewpoint from someone standing on the Earth's surface. But the magic of the moon's movement above our head goes to even more astonishing levels. By some absolutely incomprehensible quirk of nature, the moon also manages to precisely imitate the perceived annual movement of the sun each month. So when the sun at its lowest and weakest in the midwinter, the full moon is at its highest and brightest, and in the midsummer, when the sun is at its highest and brightest, the moon is at its weakest. If you want to understand how extraordinary this doppelganger effect is, stand on a hilltop or an open plain and film the sun at midwinter sunset. It is most southerly point at the horizon, and then the spring equinox again at midsummer, and again at the autumn equinox. Midsummer, that is where the day and night are equal, and that would mean the summer solstice, and the winter solstice is on December 21st. So moon, okay, then those 2 dates, film the moon setting, and you will see both go down at the same point on the horizon at the equinoxes, March 21st and September 21st. Okay, that was wrong for me, but I do know that on December 21st, that is winter solstice, where again the day and night are equal in length. But the moon will have the opposite setting point to the sun at solstices in December and June. Well, I was right? And there's a schematics of that, but we don't need the schematics. What you need is looking at pictures of something that is there on the moon's surface. That is definitely not natural. Okay, let's continue. It would be easy to dismiss the sun mimicking performances by saying that it's simply a coincidence of the moon's distance from Earth and its orbital characteristics, and that is what most scientifically trained people would say because it is self-evidently true. But what they're really saying it is so because it is so. That is a lousy explanation. which takes us nowhere. Of course, it could and logically has to be one of the big coincidences. What else could it be? Even most of the 92% of American population who state they believe in God would probably assume a coincidence, and only a minority might claim that it is a grand plan of the Almighty. The moon's distance, or moon's dance around the Earth, that produces these startling performances is extremely complex, and it's a consequence of the relative movement of the Earth and the Sun, as well as the Moon itself. The path of the Moon's orbit is inclined at 5 degrees to the line of Earth's path around the Sun, known as the plane of the ecliptic. The Earth is also tilted at an angle at 23 degrees, 27, although it is slowly decreasing, so at 7 million years it will reach 2254, after which it again will increase. So it's up and down, up and down. Well, it follows that solar eclipses that can only occur when the moon passes through the plane of the ecliptic and the sun's light is blocked by the moon. These points of intersection happen twice for each lunar orbit and are known as nodes. These nodes appear to move slowly around the background stars, giving the impression of moving backwards through the calendar, occurring 19.618 days earlier per year. The cycle completes every 18.618 years, which amounts to a surprisingly neat 6,800 days. That's pretty much close to the circumference of the moon itself. The circumference of the moon is 6,782.4 miles. That is interesting. Closely allied to its node cycle, so-called Saros cycle, which govern the periodically and reoccurrence of eclipses, where each eclipse sequence has a duration of approximately 6.5 days, 18 years, 11 days, 6 hours, 40 minutes, and 48 seconds. The people of ancient Mesopotamia knew of this astronomical principle, and it's quite possible that earlier observers, long before written records began, also were aware of it. However, one has to wait for the Saros cycle in order for a solar eclipse to repeat at the same spot on Earth, because successive eclipses in the Saros cycle happen 1/3 of the way around the world from each other. You would therefore have to wait for over 44 years to see an eclipse return to the same geographical area. There are 12 different grand Saros eclipse series at the present time. Human knowledge about movements of the moon is far older than most people might imagine. More than 25,000 years ago, an early astronomer created a lunar calendar that is still intact. The bone he engraved was excavated nearly 100 years ago from Abri-Blancard, not far from La Source in France. Experts agree that marking accurately corresponding to 2 months lunar calendar. Around 250 generations later, another astronomer also recorded this already ancient knowledge, using various natural minerals daubed onto a cave wall to leave the image of an empty rectangle followed by a series of 14 sooty dots. It was realized that these marks also were a lunar calendar. The 14 dots was argued represented the phase of the moon from full to new, after which the empty rectangle would symbolize the disappearance of the moon phase on the 50th day. If anyone doubted that the marks on the cave wall in Lascaux really was lunar calendar, or even continued to believe counting was something that did not appear until the arrival of the written word some 5,000 years ago, another picture close by might cause them to think again. On this part of the cave wall were 29 dots snaking around the bottom of a beautiful executed painting of a wild horse. 29 days in this period of the new moon fought the moon to new, through full moon to new moon again. Yet another artifact known as the Isserith baton, displayed as an even more advanced 4 months and 5 month lunar calendar. It is humbling to realize that these records were created more than 10,000 years before the Ice Age ended and the woolly mammoth disappeared. These kind of lunar observations are not restricted to southern France. The Ishanko bone, which was found in Congo, Africa, also carries markings that seem to represent a lunar calendar. What is more, and it is most identical age of the Isserith baton, though it originated many hundreds of kilometers to the south of the different continents. The existence of lunar calendars from such an early date is of great importance to our understanding and our own development. They demonstrate that our understanding of our own development. They demonstrate a clear awareness of the passing of time and the cycles of a natural world. The discovery of an archaeological artifact is a matter of chance, and it is dependent on the number of objects of any particular sort that once existed. The fact that so many of these bones, antlers, and paintings has been discovered is good indication that they were not unique, that the moon knowledge was important to the Paleolithic people of Europe and Africa, though this does give us cause to wonder why such an early lunar fascination developed. A recent discovery has shown why such intricate observations suddenly became possible from our distant forebears around 32,000 years ago. In July 2004, Rachel Kaspari of the University of Michigan and Sang-Hee Lee of the University of California published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science concerning comparisons of 768 different human fossils from a huge span of human development. They then divided the fossils into groups, adults, reproductive age, which they settled on a 50-year span, and adults that lived to be twice as old based on their tooth wear. In primitive societies, people were often grandparents by the age of 30, if they were lucky enough to live that long. Dr. Kaspari said, "We found this proportion of older to young adults in the fossil record increased over time in the Upper Paleolithic. That proportions just skyrocketed. By calculating the ratio of old to young individuals in the samples, the researchers found that their numbers soared up to 5-fold the Upper Paleolithic group, and leap that was so surprising that the team at first questioned its own result. The dramatic leap in average lifespan allowed individuals to grow older and wiser and afforded each of these new elders time to pass on their knowledge to the next generation of adults. The wear of one on the teeth suggests that this leap of longevity must have given rise to a true form of education that could build up a body of species intelligence, where the entire social group known far more than any other individual. This would allow for the first specialization of which talented men and women were fed and protected by the group to allow them to add value to their early society. This sudden transition of society of children to one of the greybeards must have been a watershed that laid the foundations for what would eventually become true civilization. The period of history known as the Upper Paleolithic period marks a time when modern man was becoming established in Europe, and there was an expansion of population creating social pressures that led to growth and trade networks, increased mobility, and more complex system of cooperation and competition. We could now understand why observational astronomy became the first real science for humankind. All science is based upon observations of patterns that stand out from the noise of simple random chance, and then, through understanding, we can make predictions of future events and outcomes. In this way, the tides of the season and the movement of the heavens could be seen being part of a single engine driving the variations of the immediate environment of the early thinkers. These early observations, scientists would also note, where patterns were completely different, events appeared to be related. Why should high tide happen twice a day and rise higher when the moon was full, or when there was no moon at all? Did the moon have some kind of control over something as massive as the oceans? Even stranger, why did women of childbearing age lose blood once every complete cycle of the moon? Yeah, that's fact, and they knew that back then. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? They were not that primitive. We already found that out. Back in 1911, a French physician by the name of J.G. Lalande was examining caves in La Salle in the Dordogne, where he chanced upon something that turns out to be very illuminating in terms of the Paleolithic mindset. Carved into the wall of a limestone rock shelter, he found a 33-centimeter female figure. The artistry involved from so early a period is quite remarkable. The more so given that it was executed with flint tools. The naked and full-bellied woman has her left hand on her abdomen, and her right hand is holding a bison horn in the shape of a crescent moon. Upon the bison horn there are 13 incised lines. The Venus of La Salle, as she called to be at least 20,000 years old. This carving is one of many that strongly suggest that there were very early recognition that human fertility seemed to be tied to the phases and the period of the moon. Human female reproduction is dependent on the menstrual cycle, which has an average of 28 days, and approximately halfway through the cycle a mature cell is released from a woman's ovaries and become available for fertilization, and that egg will only live for 24 hours, while the man's semen will live for 4 days. So you have to be pretty precise when you know that you have your ovulation. Ladies, when you want children, when you feel that little pop in your guts, then it's time for your husband to jump on you and get it done. It's not something sitting there and drinking red wine and make it all romantic. No, get it done. You only got 24-hour window. So, if sexual intercourse do not take place and the egg is not fertilized, it disintegrates after a couple of days. Well, a couple of days, it is 24 hours, then it's pretty much impossible for pregnancy. At the end of this cycle, if no conception has taken place, menstruation begins and the cycle commences once again. A series of intriguing studies by Professor Leroy Demotte of the Missouri State University has suggested that these early Venus images of the female figure were self-portraits. His analysis showed that the figurines were made from the point of view of self rather than other, that they could only represent women's view of their own body, both emotionally and physically, as she looks downward using photographic simulations of what a modern female sees of herself. McDermott demonstrates that the anatomical omission of the proportional distortion found in various Venus figurines occur naturally in autogeneous and self-generated information. The size, shape, and articulation of the objects appear to be determined by their relationship to the eye and the relative effects of the foreshortening distance and occlusion rather than any symbolic distortion, as self-portraits of women at different stages in life. McDermott believes that these earliest representations of humans form embodied in obstetrical and genealogical information and probably signified an advance in women's self-conscious control over the material conditions of their reproductive lives. So women 20,000 years ago were pretty much aware that they were ready to make children. That's pretty impressive, right? Okay, the lunar month symbolism in Venus of Lascelles strongly suggests that women 20,000 years ago knew the length of their menstrual cycles and already equated them with the phases of the moon. The 13 lines of the crescent-shaped bison horn could easily relate to the 13 menstrual cycles an average woman could expect each year. At the same time, it is not uncommon for a human female to menstruate on the same moon phase each month, because 28 days is merely an average, whilst the period between the full moon and the next is 29.5 days. The historical connection between human fertility and the moon even extend to the word menstrual. It derives from the Latin menses, meaning month, whilst the word month is very ancient and refers to the period of 4 weeks as being one month. The connection between human fertility and the cycles of the moon is considered to be apparent rather than actual. But it isn't the least surprising that the possibility of relationship was noticed by our ancient ancestors. The clincher probably came with someone realized that the average digestion period of human female from conception to birth is around 266 days or 9 full lunar synodic cycles. In a social and religious sense, fertility undoubtedly played a crucial part in the lives of people at the time of the Venus of Lascelles was carved. It is more or less universally accepted that female deities were important to human culture for thousands of years. Of prehistoric statues of pregnant women with exaggerated genitals and breast are common from the Paleolithic or the Neolithic periods, and there are strong indications that the existence of fertility-based deity who was come down to us as the great goddess. The Venus Lascelles could quite easily be representation of this deity, complete with the representation of the heavenly body which she was equated, the moon. About 6,000 years ago, there was an outbreak of a building in the stone across the western part of Europe, particularly in the British Isles, that tells us a great deal about the Neolithic people and fascination with the moon. Dr. Philip Stuke from the University of the Western Ontario in Canada had always been puzzled as why there were no maps or drawings of the moon older than the one drawn by Leonardo da Vinci 500 years ago. he decided to look at ancient manuscripts and the records of excavations of the Neolithic sites of the British Isles. Amongst other sites, he looked at truly amazing prehistoric structures known as the New Grange and Nonth in the county Meath, Ireland, and the recently excavated Nonth that he found 5,200-year-old carving made up to set of lines and dots. Dr. Stuck realized that it was not simply a Stone Age doodle, but a drawing of the face of the moon, he said. And this is his words. I was amazed when I saw it. Place the markings over a picture of the full moon and you will see that they line up. And it's without doubt a map of the moon, the most ancient one ever found. It is all there in the carvings. You can see the overall patterns of the lunar features, from features such as Mare Humoron through the Mare of Crisium. The people who carved this moon map were the first scientists. They knew a great deal about the motions of the moon. They were not primitive at all. Okay, these people were not merely moon watchers. Chris, along with Robert Lomas, has already published his analysis of the astronomical functions of nearby New Grange, which was carefully designed and engineered to allow the light of Venus to penetrate deep into the domed structure once every 8 winter solstices. This focused beam of light gave these early scientists a very precise tracking of Venus, which allowed them to maintain a calendar that would be accurate to a matter of seconds of each 8-year cycle. That's amazing. There were no doubt that these builders were far from primitive, an archaeological convention once suggested. Investigation of Nonth have already shown that at certain times that moonlight shines down the eastern passage of the structure. Dr. Stuck has now pointed out that these narrow moonbeams would also fall right onto the Neolithic lunar map. He concluded it was obviously built by men who had a sophisticated understanding of the motions of the sun, moon, and stars. Let me have a slurp of water here. The switch from a powerful female deity often equated with the moon, and solar-based masculine deities seem to have taken place about the same time humanity began to discover writing. This occurred in Sumer, modern-day Iraq, and Kuwait, and Egypt just after structures like New Grange and Nonth has been constructed. One researcher, Dr. Leonard Schlein, chief of laparoscopic surgery at the California Pacific Medical Center, has suggested this connection in his controversial but immensely popular book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. Here, Schlein outlines his view that the evolution of writing specifically involved the use of practical left hemisphere of the brain as a direct contrast to many thousands of years during which the intuitive, inspirational right hemisphere had predominated. He maintains that this explains the virtual abandonment of generally peaceful, feminine-centered society across much of Europe and Middle East and Asia. This transition was staggered, but began around 3,000 years before Christ, when a more aggressive patriarchal social structure emerged with masculine deities predominating. This thesis sounds very reasonable, and if true, we could expect to find this legacy of moon-associated goddesses still present at the dawn of writing, when myths of stories were first being categorized And it is indeed the case. In Sumer we find Nana, a very early moon goddess, whilst in nearby Egypt we're writing this king just a little later. An even better example in terms of Isis, who rose to become one of the most important and revered goddesses across the whole known world for several thousand years. Isis originated as a moon goddess, and the fact is born out of specific parts of her story. Isis had to rebuild the body of her husband, Osiris, after he had been brutally murdered, and his body chopped into pieces. She traveled all over the world to find the dismembered parts of her husband, of which there were 14 in total. The story is analogous to the gradual increase in size of moon across 14 days from the new to full, referring to Egyptians. Plutarch, the Greek essayist writing around 60 AD, said, Egyptian priestess called the moon the mother of the universe, because the moon, having the light which makes moist and pregnant, is promotive of the generation of living beings. Although to some early cultures the moon was associated with a masculine deity such as Babylonian Sin, for example, in by far the majority of cases the moon was considered to be female and carried a strong aspect of fertility. This goddess had many names across the world. To the Greeks she was Artemis, to the Romans called her Diana and Selene. Her Finnish name was Ku, that's Finland, and the Celts she was worshipped as Ceridwen. Nor was she ignored in the New World. In what is now Mexico, the moon goddess was called, oh man, that's a difficult word, Tilovli, and on the Mayans she was called Ichup. These names represent only a tiny proportion of those that are still remembered, and there can be no doubt that all that Earth moon has been deeply important to humanity across the whole world for many thousands of years. The moon was almost certainly the first heavenly body used to measure the passage of time for reasons other than human fertility. In its capacity, it is still enshrined in our own systems by the use of months to split the solar year. Looking back at history, it is easy to see the repeated attempts of different cultures to reconcile lunar time, with a growing recognition of length of the year, which is governed by the sun. A truly ancient culture such as that of the Sumerians never abandoned a lunar calendar beginning each month at the first crescent of the moon showed itself in the dawn sky. However, at the same time the Sumerian priest adopted a stylized month of 30 days in length, which fitted the solar year in a more regular way. Lunar reckoning is still used in Islam, a legacy of the religion's origin in the Arabian Peninsula. In a physical sense, this intense interest in the moon is not at all surprising. We tend to forget in our modern world of electric lights that there was a time, not so long ago, when the moon was welcome sight in the dark night, but at the same time it was recognized to have awesome powers. It was believed by cultures across the world that the moon could have a bearing on people's mental states. Yeah, you bet. Look at traffic around full moon. It's horrible. Well, the English word lunatic enshrines this belief, and up to the very recent times, it was considered that those who were mentally unstable could be triggered into madness and violence by the appearance of the full moon, Well, I hold that to be true. In addition, our ancient ancestors were well aware that the moon was responsible for one of the most frightening and awe-inspiring happenings in a periodical stole the sun from the sky. Solar eclipses happen when the new moon passes directly in between the sun and the earth. At such times, the shadow of the moon was cast upon the earth. If the observer is in the right place of the earth, it will appear that the light of the sun has been blotted out, and day can suddenly become night. A total eclipse is a truly remarkable event because in order for it to happen, the size of the moon and the sun as seen from Earth must be identical. Nevertheless, it does happen, and it must be a stroke of absolute terror into the hearts of early humans. This fear could have been slightly mitigated when it became possible to predict eclipses, something that a number of early cultures sought to do. A second sort of eclipse, which is seen more often because the planetary geometry involved, is called lunar eclipse, and in its own way this must have been just as potent and frightening. A lunar eclipse happens when the moon moves through the shadow of Earth so that the moon is seen to slowly disappear in a clear night. Of these occasions, the moon's face is not totally blotted out by Earth's shadow, but appearing as a ghostly blood-red disk. Even today, this is a chilling sight, and one can sympathize with the people who viewed this event with a sense of foreboding. Without a good understanding of the planetary cycles involved, eclipses of both sorts could easily appear to be random events, and many of early cultures sought to discover the patterns involved, probably working on the assumption that understanding inferred a degree of control. This may well have been represented at the first serious attempts of astronomy. It is known that both the Assyrians and the Babylonians could predict eclipses. In both cases, many of the astronomical skills were inherited from the early Sumerians, and in highly likely the eclipse predictions already existed 3,000 years before Christ. Further west, there have been suggestions to some of the megalithic monuments that were built as eclipse predictors, maybe as early as 4000 BC. Astronomer Gerald Hawkins, in his book Stonehenge Decoded, using a computer model to demonstrate that Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England, might have been partly built with eclipse predictions in mind. By at least the second millennium before Christ, the Chinese also could predict eclipses. As far back as 2,650 years before Christ, Li Shu was writing about the subject of astronomy. 3.5 centuries later, ancient Chinese astrologers had sophisticated observatory buildings, and solar eclipses were considered essential for forecasting the future health and successes of the emperor. These astronomers were keen to be accurate, as failure to get the prediction correct was likely to be lethal for them. In one documented case referring to the eclipse of 2,136 years before Christ, the two astrologers who got it wrong were beheaded. The following recorded their fate. Here lie the bodies of Hu and He, whose fates, though sad, is risible, being slain because they could not spy the eclipse, which were invisible. Author is unknown. For thousands of years the moon was a thing of awe and wonder to human beings across the entire planet, and remains to be for millions of people today, despite technological advances and good understanding of its physical characteristics. For example, the moon has always been equated with agriculture. Even in some parts of the fully developed world, there are farmers and gardeners who would not dream of either planting or harvesting without a direct reference to the phase of the moon, or even the part of the zodiac which occupies at any particular point in time. The moon is the fastest moving astronomical body when viewed from Earth, and it appears to pass through all the zodiac signs in only 27.3 days. Generally speaking, crops were often planted close to the new moon so they could grow with the phase of the moon. Whilst there was no known scientific basis for such ideas, the advice offered is often very specific and don't vary much across the world, nor does moon law relate only to sowing seeds. For example, it is suggested that the picking of apples for immediate eating, it is the best to harvest them at the time of the full moon, though that they are to be stored. The new moon is preferred, since the apples are believed to be less likely to rot. Even today, the moon has always been important to humanity, and it is essential to one of the most important festivals of the Christian religion, Easter, which falls on the early spring of the northern hemisphere. It is an ancient celebration of the rebirth that long predates its association with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The New Testament states that Jesus Christ was crucified on the eve of the Passover, before rising again a short time later. In consequence, the ancient Easter festival was reassigned to commemorate this miracle. There was, however, considerable debate over the date on which Easter should fall. The early Christians of Jewish origin celebrated the resurrection immediately following their Passover festival, which according to their lunar calendar fell on the evening of the full moon. This was the 14th day in the month of Nisan, the first month of their new year, thereby causing Easter to fall on different days of the week. This new breed of non-Jewish Christians from around the Roman Empire wished to commemorate the resurrection on Sunday, their newly defined Sabbath. In 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine the first convened a Council of Nicaea to debate whether or not Jesus Christ was a man of God. Having officially designated Jesus to be God by a narrow margin, the council then ruled that the Easter festival should be celebrated on the first Sunday after full moon following a vernal equinox, and that the full moon should occur on a Sunday and thereby coincide with the Passover festival. Easter should be commemorated on a Sunday following. The origin of the word Easter is thought to come from Estra, the Anglo-Saxon name for a Teutonic goddess of spring and fertility. Her festival was celebrated on the day of vernal equinox, which now falls around March 21st, when the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and the day has 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. Traditions associated with this pagan festival survive in the idea of an Easter rabbit, a symbol of fertility, and in brightly decorated Easter eggs, which were a symbol of rebirth. That was chapter 1. Next chapter will be the science of the ancients, but that will be in the next episode. Over and out for now. Well, actually, I did not collect 16,700 pictures of the moon in order just to let them fade away. I did first chapter of the book of Christopher Knight and Alan Butler, Who Built the Moon, and I'm going to make it into a playlist so you can get chapter 1 as a refresher. But I'm going to refresh something anyway if you choose to start here. And that is that we know that the moon has a diameter of 2160 2,160 miles. Its circumference is 6,782.4 miles, and 1 degree, as you see on the images, is equivalent to 18.84 miles. The latitude of each image is actually an area that is 89.30 miles, and longitude is 44.84 miles, and that gives a total of 4,004.21 square miles. And the latitude on each picture is 4.74 degrees, and the longitude is 2.38 degrees. So that gives you an idea of how big an image and how big an area that you're actually looking at. And I can assure you there's a lot of stuff on the surface of the moon that is quite compelling, and telling everyone who is having a closer look at it, you can choose to pause at any point in time because you see something, and then you can continue to the next frame. It's entirely up to you, but I bought this book because it's very interesting, because we know that during the Apollo program, NASA detonated a 1 kiloton TNT bomb on the surface of the moon for whatever reason, and the moon was ringing like a gong for half an hour. And later on they detonated 11 ton of TNT for another stupid reason, and the moon was ringing like a gong again, but this time it was echoing for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Plus the moon's surface, the entire moon, was reverberating like it was kind of like shock absorbers inside it. It was vibrating, and yet it did not fall apart. So there's something to the moon. And one thing I have noticed by looking at all these images, and this is one thing that we know demons here on Earth, they like to mock God, and when they are attacking a victim, they're always making 3 stripes of a scratch mark, and that is for them to mock God, the Trinity. And when you look at the moon pictures in itself, you will come to find out that many of these domes, that they are not craters but domes, they come in sections of 3. They are also placed in a string of pearls, but you can see there is a pattern to it. It's not random, not at all. Just from a viewer's perspective, if you're not familiar with the moon, it will look like it's random, but it is not. There's a very precise architecture behind the surface of this moon. And then you will claim, yeah, but the Earth is flat and blah blah blah, all that. Well, this is not really up for discussion whether the Earth is flat or not and we are under a dome. That might be, but this dome is so vast that there's room for the moon to be of that size, so it's a very big dome. And then you will say, well, in the beginning God created 2 lights, the sun and the moon. Yeah, but it just say lights, right? It doesn't go in detail of what is the construct of this light. So maybe from the very beginning, the moon was an outpost for the angels to watch over us, the watchers. I don't know. I can't find any literature or anything that points towards that. But what I want you to do is, having an open mind, and just listen to what these two authors have to say about this. And chapter 2 goes like this: the science of the ancients. And here's a quote from Einstein. He says, "The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing." And I've always been curious about the moon. Ever since I was a little child, I've always been looking at it in binoculars. I didn't have a telescope, but I was looking at it and I was fascinated. And that's just about it. And now I have a powerful telescope, and I would like to sit and watch the moon and make videos live. But I'm living in Texas, and rattlesnakes, they are out at night. So is copperheads, so is coral snakes, and other creeping things. So that's not really a good idea. All of a sudden feel something slithering around your foot. No, thank you. That would be a shocker. You probably get bit because I jerk, and then they bite because they don't like sudden movements. So, in the early 1930s, a young Scottish engineer noticed that several of the widely ignored prehistoric megalith sites near his home appeared to have lunar alignments. He decided to study some of these sites, and he began a process of careful surveying that was eventually leading him to a discovery of staggering importance. As a young engineer at Glasgow University, Alexander Thom visited a number of prehistoric stone structures near to his home in Scotland during the early 1930s. He marveled at the grandeur and admired the way so many of the giant stones had survived the weathering of more than 5,000 years, as well as proving resistant to the thieving tendencies of croft and road builders across dozens of centuries. And he contemplated the various sites. He mused over their purpose, and he looked to the horizon and could imagine how the stones might have been used as sighting stones for astronomical purposes. When he checked out the rising and the setting points of the sun and the moon across the year, his hunch appeared to be borne out. His first survey was a site known as Gallanish on the Isle of Lewis in the Hebrides, the west coast of Scotland. This complex of standing stones revealed many astronomical alignments and is today often referred to as the Moon Temple. Thom went out and spent nearly half a century carefully surveying the so-called megalith, the word meaning giant stones. Structures that lay scattered across the countryside from islands to northern Scotland down to the French region of Brittany. Along the way, he became a highly respected professor of engineering at Oxford University until his retirement in 1961. Thom had quickly realized that the prehistoric builders were engineers like himself, and they had surprisingly sophisticated knowledge of geometry and astronomy. The approach taken by this talented engineer was to access what he believed the site had been intended to do, and then redesign it himself. He quickly gained an empathy with the Stone Age builders that gave him a real insight into the purpose of each site that would possibly be lost on a conventional archaeologist. Once he had a picture in his mind of what he thought their plan had been, he went away to create his own solution to the assumed problem. Having drawn up his own design, he then returned to compare the site layout to his own blueprint. Through this process, he could predict the location of missing stones, and on further inspection he could usually reveal the socket hole that confirmed his theory. Thom developed this statistical technique to establish the relative positions of the stones, and over time something spectacular unusual emerged from the amassed data. These prehistoric builders had not been logging huge stone willy-nilly. They have manufactured these structures working with a standard unit of measurements across the huge area of thousands of square miles of what then dense forest and barren moorland. It is amazing that these supposedly primitive people could have an international convention for a unit of length, but the mystery deepens because Thumb was eventually able to describe the supreme accuracy of a unit he called the megalithic yard. This was not approximate measure taken from paces or body parts. It was equal to 2.722 feet, plus minus 0.002 feet, or actually 82.96656 centimeters, and a margin there of plus minus 0.061 centimeters. That's for you Europeans to understand. I understand it. The inches and feet, they're a little more tricky, because they're not round numbers, which the metric system is. It's very easy, the metric system. Simple, easy to understand. Thumb was also able to demonstrate that this unit was frequently used in its double and half form, as well as being broken down into 40 subunits for use in design work that he designated as the megalithic inches. Most archaeologists refuted the finding on the basis that the idea for a unit of measurement that was more accurate than a modern measurement tape was absurd. Thumb admitted that he could not suggest how it could be achieved, but he stood with his evidence that simply said it had been done. In our previous book, Civilization 1, we described how we set out to investigate the concept of the megalithic yard. Our initial hypothesis was that if the unit was not an error of Thumb's data analysis, it logically should have two properties. One, it should have an origin in something meaningful rather than just being abstraction that adopted by everyone. Two, it should have a means of reproduction, and it could be used by anyone without reference to any sort of standard measuring rod. That would be difficult to manufacture and impossible to keep accurate across centuries. We realized that our assumption could be wrong on either or both counts, but it turned out that we were both correct. Thumb had not made an error. As we described in Civilization 1, that's a book I need to read, I guess, the megalithic yard is a geodetic unit that has an integral, has a whole number relationship to the polar circumference of the Earth. We found that these early megalithic builders viewed a circle and had 366 degrees rather than 360 that we use today. We realized that there really should be 366 degrees in a circle for a very good reason, that there were 366 rotations of Earth in one orbit around the Sun, meaning in the time that the Earth is rotating around the Sun, it has rotated around itself 366 times. One solar orbit is of course a year, but there is a very slight difference between the number of rotations of the planet and the 365 days a year. This is because the mean solar day is based on the time between the Sun is being in its zenith, right above you, and 2 consecutive days of 86,400 seconds. But actual rotation or sidereal day takes 233 seconds less. All those saved seconds add up to exactly one more day over the year. A sidereal day can easily be appreciated by observing a star returning to the same point in the heavens on 2 consecutive nights. this one spin of our planet because it's unaffected by the secondary motion of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Wheels within wheels. Early cultures, oh, that sounds interesting. Something like Ezekiel, wheels within wheels. Interesting. Early cultures frequently took their lead from nature, and they were fond of wheels within wheels. If the circle of the heavens had 366 parts, why should every circle not follow the same rule? We were able to confirm this hypothesis by a variety of means, including evidence from later cultures that appear to have adopted the 366 degrees principle. The approach our megalithic ancestors took, we argue, was to hypothetically divide the circle of the Earth into 366 degrees, with 60 minutes per degree and 6 seconds per minute. It was reasonable to assume that these ancient builders used the polar circumference of the Earth that passed through the area around the British Isles. Our planet is nearly spherical, but it does have a bulge in the center between the poles, so the equatorial circumference is a little longer than the polar. There are varying estimations of the Earth's polar circumference, with NASA, as an example, quoting that the average figure of 39,941 kilometers, whilst other sources regularly quote 40,000.6 kilometers or 40,000.10 kilometers, but for the most frequent used figure appears to be 40,008 kilometers. Undoubtedly, much depends on where the measurement is taken, or if an average of them is at all calculated. Interestingly, the shortest polar circumference, one that had least landmass, is one that passes through the British Isles, is now considered as the zero line of longitude. That's where we get the Greenwich Mean Time, meaning zero. That's where the days start for the whole world. But there's also another possibility. Just for interest, we looked at the flattest possible circumference achievable on the globe. An example, a line that equally bisects the planet that has most sea and least land. We amassed to discover that a person standing in the middle of Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, where Stonehenge and the megalithic circle of Avebury were built, is the absolute center of such a line. This means that if we consider Stonehenge to be the top of the world, the imaginary equator from that point is almost 98% sea, more than any other object on Earth. This line passes across the South Atlantic, skims just below Africa, moves up across the Indian Ocean, clips small pieces of land at Banda Aceh, Sumatra, Thailand and Vietnam, over the South China Sea, and even more than 20,000 kilometers across the Pacific to pass over a section of South America. As far as we know, such a line has not been measured, and we cannot imagine how it could be measured without the aid of modern satellite technology. However, just because we do not know how it could have been done does not mean that it was not done. Without further evidence, we have to assume that it's pure coincidence that Stonehenge stands on the only place on Earth to be equidistant from the optimum and near sea level circumference of the globe. We can only assume that polar circumference was used as taking the 40,008 figure and translated into 48,221.8 megalithic yards, using Thumb's central value for the unit. It was then subdivided as follows, and a polar circumference is 48,002.2 megalithic yards. 1 degree is 131.2 0.7 megalithic yards. 1 minute is 2,196 megalithic yards. 1 second is 366 megalithic yards. So this brilliant system of geometry starts with 366 degrees and finishes with second of arc that is 366 megalithic yard long. Self-evidently an amazing set of wheels within wheels. We knew the system must work this way because we found that the latter Ionian culture, which developed the Mediterranean island of Crete around 2000 BC, also used the megalithic second of arc. However, the Ionians subdivided it into 1,000 parts to become their standard unit measurement that was equal to 30.36 centimeters. This unit was dubbed the Ionian foot by the Canadian archaeologist Professor Joseph Graham, who first detected its use in the palaces of the ancient Crete. We went to demonstrate how any person could generate a highly accurate megalithic yard measuring the movement of Venus in the evening sky using a rope, some twine, a blob of clay, and a few sticks. This secret was to take 1/366th part of the horizon and time the passage of Venus across it, and then to cause a piece of twine with a blob of clay on to the end to swing like a pendulum 366 times during that period. For fulcrum to the same center of the blob was mathematically perfect, half megalithic yard or 20 megalithic inches. The process was simple to carry out, and it works on the fact that the pendulum is responsive to only two factors, the length of the pendulum and the mass of Earth. If the pendulum beat 366 times during the transit of Venus across a 366th part of the sky, you have your measure. And it says, see appendix for more detailed explanation of the pendulum method. And I haven't really looked that up, to be honest. I'm sorry about that. But we need to continue, right? It is doubtful that these ancient stonemasons realized the fact, but the period of time that they watched Venus and elected to subdivide into 366 beats is equal to the difference between a mean solar day and a sidereal day. Our starting point had to be to search the possible sources of reliable measurements available from nature, and we found that there was only one, the turning of Earth on its axis as seen by watching the movement of heavens. It was possible to time the passage of a star, or in this case planet Venus, with reliable accuracy using a pendulum. The pendulum turned a unit of time into a unit of length, because the time beat will always produce a fixed length, with tiny variations due to latitude and altitude. It was then simple matter to turn a unit length into measure of volume and capacity by creating cubes and filling them with liquid or dry goods such as barley or wheat. However, we were not prepared for the shock we received when we create a cube with sides of 4 megalithic inches and found that it held a pint, and it was accurate to the staggering 1 part in 5,000 against the standard laid down in the year of 1601. That's pretty impressive. Doubling the size of 8 megalithic inches produces accurate gallon. This is amazing. You gotta admit that's pretty amazing. And doubling again produced by the old dry measure known as Bushnell. The mystery was compounded when we filled the pint cube with barley and found that it weighed exactly 1 pound. Oh man, this is amazing. Things turned from the sublime to the ridiculous when further experimentation shown that a sphere with a diameter of 6 metric inches held virtually 1 liter and 1/10 times the size weight of a metric ton when filled with water, all to an accuracy of better than 99%. That's just bloody amazing. Excuse my language, but that is amazing. So they've not been all stupid, the ancient, right? They knew what they were doing. Apparently they did. And where did they have that knowledge from? I'm clueless to that, and I'm not going to sit and say, well, this is the fallen ancients giving them that knowledge. I don't subscribe to that, honestly. The fact that thumb, apparently meaningless megalithic yard extracted from the surveying of hundreds of prehistoric ruins produced these cubic and spherical feats is not debatable. That's amazing. A guy up there in the back then in the early 20th century go out and do these things, and he finds this out, that these measurements is just dead on. I mean, 99%, a gallon, a pound, a ton. That's pretty amazing, and he just finds that out. So produces these cubic spherical feats is not debatable. No one, no matter how skeptical they might be, can deny the simple math. Neither can they deny that the odds of such compounded apparent connections being coincidence are very high. Yet the pound and the pint are thought to be medieval, and the liter and the ton were invented at the end of the 8th century. A connection seemed impossible. No, it was already there. Meonian was using this system, and that's before Christ they were doing this. And we modern people here claims that these systems, well, they were later invented by mathematicians, when they were not. They were already there, already invented thousands of years before they came out and told the world that they're smart. So that's pretty amazing. Then we looked at Sumerian people who lived in the region we now call Iraq. Some 5,000 years ago, they attributed with inventing writing glass, the wheel, the hour, minute and second of time, as well as the 360-degree circle with its subdivisions of 60 minutes and 60 seconds of arc. Quite amazing people. So, as we probed the achievements of this civilization, we found that the unit of length in the Sumerian had used was virtually a meter at 99.988 centimeters. That's pretty darn close to an exact meter. They had also used weights and capacities that were as equal match to the kilo and liter of the French metric system. That's pretty amazing. That's 5,000 years ago, and the French think they invented the metric system. Well, it was invented 5,000 years earlier by them, the Sumerians. I didn't even know that. That's new to me. Wow. Quite a coincidence, we thought, but it was nothing of the kind. For when we applied the principles of the pendulum and the Sumerian unit of length called the double cush, we found that the pendulum of this length beat at the rate per second. This meant that the Sumerian key unit of length and their key unit of time were two sides of the same coin when used as a pendulum. A double cush pendulum would always beat out a second, and a pendulum that beat at the rate of a second would always be double cush in length. This demonstrates beyond all reasonable doubt that the Sumerians used pendulums to define their measurements. The question was, had they used the same Venus watching principle as the Metholithic builders of the British Isles to reproduce their units? Sumerian written records tells us that the planet Venus was considered to be the goddess Inanna, who was the central importance of their culture, so it seems entirely plausible. If they had used the same principle, it seems logical that they would be employed their own values, essentially keeping the same software but inputting their own data. Instead of the 366 degrees of Metholithic system, we would have to use the familiar 360 degrees first used by the Sumerians. And when we checked out the results for such processes, it worked perfectly. When the horizon was divided into 360 parts and Venus was timed across a part of the sky, the approximate time of the year double Cush pendulum meters out exactly 240 seconds, and the period of 240 seconds is recorded as being so important to the Sumerians it had its own name, Agesh. It therefore seems certain that these people followed a Metholithic idea, creating a unit of length for timing the movement of Venus across the sky. The American connection. Later in our research, we came across a letter written by the great American statesman Thomas Jefferson and sent to the House of Representatives on July 4, 1776. We know what that is, the Declaration of Independence. In this letter, Jefferson laid out a recommendation for a new system of weight and measures of the new United States, and he had helped to establish. He gave his reasoning and described some unusual facts he had uncovered whilst developing his intended units. He explained how he had realized that there was only one aspect of nature that gave rise to any reliable unit measure, which he named the turning of the earth. So, like ourselves and the Metholithic builders of 5 and 6 millennia before him, he used the heavens to provide a basis of all measurements. In his letter he stated that he had come to realize that the imperial system of measurement used in Britain was not an accumulation of unrelated units as generally imagined. On the contrary, he said, that is their harmony indicated to him, and they were members of a group of measurements unit from very high antiquity. He gave numbers of reasons for his belief, including his astonishment that the foot made up of 12 inches was directly related to an ounce weight through the use of cubes. He said, "It has been found by accurate experiments that a cubic foot of rainwater weighs 1,000 ounces. A word de push, imperial." What? That was a weird word, but that means imperial. It could be coincident that a cubic foot holds 1,000 ounces of rainwater, not 999 or 1001, but exactly 1,000. All that cube has been has size that are perfectly 10 by 10 by 10 and 1/10 of a foot. But Jefferson did not think so, or nor do we. However, it was Jefferson's proposed units that fascinated us. They were never adopted, but their properties were amazing. Jefferson's logical mind also caused him to use a pendulum to convert time into a linear unit. He decided that he should use a pendulum and had 1 beat 1 second as the basis for his measurement system. Of course, Jefferson had no idea that that second had come from the Sumerian culture, and it had been created by use of a pendulum in the first place. Jefferson added to improvements suggested to him by a certain Mr. Graham of Philadelphia, that he used rigid pendulum of a very thin metal without a weight on the end, because it is more accurate than the conventional type of pendulum. The rules changed with such pendulum, known as rod. A rod was to be exactly 50% longer than the pendulum to produce the same time period. Jefferson's timing piece that beat once per second is known as a second rod, and it is 149.1 centimeters in length. The world knew nothing of the Sumerian culture in Jefferson's time, and he could not possibly have been aware of his rod that beat once per second were essentially 3 cush in length, just a whisker less than 1/2 a meter. Remembering that the meter had not been invented at that time, but it was already there by the Sumerian. But the French claim that they are the author of the metric system, meaning the meter, 1 centimeter, 1 decimeter, 1 meter, a decimeter is 10 centimeters. 3 cush rod behaves exactly like a double cush pendulum, and therefore it beats 240 times during a 360th part of a day, observable by watching Venus move across a 360th part of the sky. Jefferson was therefore accidentally reenacting the ritual used by the Sumerian astronomers priests nearly 5,000 years earlier and connecting with the principle of prehistoric measurements. The units that Jefferson identified from his ancient process were all based on the length of the second rod. He wrote, "Let the second rod then, as before described, be the standard of measure, and let it be divided into 5 equal parts, each of which shall be called a foot. For perhaps it might be better generally to retain the name of the nearest present measure, where one is tolerably near. It would be about 1/4 of an inch shorter than the present foot. Let the foot be divided into 10 inches. Let the inch into 10 lines, the line into 10 points. Let the feet make a decad. 10 decad, one rood. 10 rood, a furlong. 10 furlongs, a mile." When we can see that his proposed decad was based on a double second rod. It was equivalent to 6 Sumerian cush, and his furlong was equivalent to 600 cush. This brings about even deeper connection with the people of ancient Iraq, because they used a system of counting that 6 decimal, which means it used a combination of base 10 and base 60, and had a system of notation that worked. So it can be seen that the figure of 600 is indeed a Sumerian value of Sumerian units of length, but not only in the Jefferson furlong equal to 600 cush, it's almost a perfect 360 methylitic yard. Strangely, Jefferson had connected well with both methylitic and the Sumerian system, but something even stranger happened when we took Jefferson's furlong and multiplied it by 666 and 666 again, meaning 366 in second equals 39,961 kilometers, and that's pretty much the circumference of the Earth. That's pretty close. As we already mentioned, the range of assumed length of the Earth's circumference varies by a few kilometers depending on what sort of consoles, probably because each cross-section will differ, and tides and plate tectonics involving the mountains leaving room for some debate. At the higher end, at 40,008 kilometers, it is widely used. However, if you take NASA's preferred figures, they quote that the polar radius of 6,356.8 kilometers equates to a polar circumference of 39,941. That's pretty damn close. That is freaking close. We're talking about 20 meters. So Jefferson, before we even had technology, come up with this proposal, and he's, according, if you hold that up to NASA's figures, he's only 20 meters higher than NASA's measurements. That's pretty amazing. Bloody amazing. That means that 366 seconds Jefferson furlong match NASA's estimate of Earth's size to an accuracy of 99.95%, which is as perfect as it gets. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Let's just say that. Problem with Foucault's pendulum. We became more and more fascinated by everything to do with pendulums. During one particular telephone conversation, which has gone on for an hour, we had yet again discussed at length the idea that it might come from some unknown laws of astrophysics that was revealed by the pendulums at work here. We consider some highly speculative thoughts that range from standing electromagnetic sine waves due to gyroscopic effect of the Earth's spin through the gravitations containing packets of information about geometrical shape. But we agreed that if we did not know enough to even start to investigate such ideas. Chris wrote in the following paragraph into draft of his chapter of the summary of our mutual frustration and finished work for the day. We have to admit that we still do not understand why it is so, but the use of pendulum in association with these ancient values appears to be elemental to planet Earth. Some physical reality seems to be at work here. Every pendulum reacts to the mass of Earth, but there seems to be some kind of harmonic response at certain rhythms, points where the mass of the spin of the planet resonate in some way. Of course, everything is frequency. Everything is in balance. And as we see right now, those people that call themselves smart heads, like Mikio Kukuk and NASA and even politicians claiming to be so smart, they are all busy destroying our planet. It's not us, it's them that is allowing this destruction. And we know where that comes from. That comes from the evil one. Because the evil one wants to destroy this planet and everything in it. But first of all, he needs to drag humans to hell. That will be his utmost achievement. And then he can blow up the planet. That's pretty much his idea. Bring us to hell, and then he can destroy the rest. But at that very point in time, everything changed. At 5 o'clock the following morning, Chris was unable to sleep and had decided to get up and make a cup of tea. It was then that library angel turned up, looking for something to read. He pulled the delivery sleeve of the magazine that had arrived in the post in the previous day and flicked it open. The main feature article in this edition, The New Scientist, was entitled Shadow Over Gravity. It sounded interesting, even early on a dark November morning. But he quickly realized it was far more important than merely interesting. The opening paragraph was incredibly similar to which opened this book, carrying a description on how it feels to witness a total eclipse. And then it transpired to be the thrust of the article that solar eclipses has profound effect on pendulums, a debate that is presently raging as to why this should be the case. But because the suggestion has been made that the pendulum may well be the key to a significant hole in Einstein's theory of relativity. Yeah, it's flawed. The starting point concerns the works of Jean-Bernard Léon Foucault, who demonstrated a special quality of pendulums at the great exhibition held in London in 1851. His pendulum, now always referred to as the Foucault pendulum, is simply a very heavy weight fastened to a very long wire attached to a ceiling inside a very tall building. with an universal joint, allowing it to rotate freely around in a fixed point so that it will swing in a slow arc in any direction. Giant pendulums of this kind are now routine exhibits at some of the major museums around the world, including the Smithsonian in Washington and the Science Museum in London. Once set in motion, its direction of swing will appear to rotate at a rate about 12 degrees an hour. But this is actually an illusion, because it is the observer and the rest of the world that is moving, whilst the pendulum is maintaining a fixed swing back and forth in relation to the universe. This happens because the pendulum is independent of the movement of the Earth, which is rotating underneath the pendulum, making it appear, let me turn this off because it's humming, making it appear that the pendulum is changing direction. The reason a pendulum swings is because the Earth's gravity continually tugs down on it. According to Einstein's general theory of relativity, this relentless tugging is due to the fact that every mass bends the fabric of space-time around it, causing other masses to slide down into the dimple it creates in time-space. In space-time. The amount of rotation of a Foucault pendulum is dependent on the latitude. At the North and South Pole, a pendulum appears to rotate through the entire 360 degrees once every turn of the Earth, each solar day. Because the planet rotates all the way around underneath it, in the Northern Hemisphere, at the latitude of the British Isles, the rate of rotation is reduced to around 280 degrees per day, and the rate of rotation continues to fall the closer it gets to the equator, where a Foucault pendulum does not rotate at all. I didn't know that. Interesting. For over hundreds of years, everyone knew that Foucault's pendulum would swing in an entirely predictable manner at any specific location. Then in 1954, a French engineer, economist, and would-be a physicist by name of Maurice Allais found that this was not always the case. He was conducting an experiment at the School of Mining in Paris to investigate the possible link between magnetism and gravitation, in which he realized a Foucault pendulum every 14th minute of 30 days at night, recording the direction of a rotation in degrees. By chance, a solar eclipse occurred on one of those days. Each day the pendulum moved with mechanical precision, but June 30th, 1954, when a partial eclipse occurred, one of Allais' assistants realized that the pendulum has gone haywire. As the eclipse began, the swing plane of the pendulum suddenly started to rotate backwards. It veered furthest off course 20 minutes before maximum eclipse. When the moon covered the last portion of the sun's surface before returning to its normal swing once the eclipse was over, it seems that the pendulum had somehow been influenced by the alignment of the Earth and the Moon and the Sun. This was totally unexpected and utterly startling. Allais' experiment was being conducted indoors, out of the sunlight, so there was no apparent way the eclipse could have affected it. Allais was at a loss to explain what had taken place, but when he conducted an improved version of his experiment in June and July 1958 with two pendulums 6 kilometers apart, he found the same effect. Then, during a partial solar eclipse on October 22, 1959, Allais once again witnessed the same erratic rotation, but this time similar effects were reported by 3 Romanian scientists who knew nothing of Allais' work. So they're independent of each other and they're finding the same results. That's not a coincidence, because there are no coincidences. Many people have questioned his results, mainly because science does not like that which cannot explain. Many others has now repeated the experience with mixed results. Some found no measurable effect, but most have confirmed the result at different locations, including the one conducted in an underground laboratory. It is interesting to note that 1988 LA was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for economics. Like Alexander Thumb and many other paradigm busters, a major discovery had come from someone working outside their own field. These are bright people who are driven by curiosity and who had not the products of conventional training. LA despairs at the standard of those that oppose without logic or reasoning. In the history of science, every revolutionary result meets with a very strong opposition. Relativists say I'm wrong without proving any demonstration. Most of them haven't even read what I wrote. In 1970, Irvin Saxel and Mildred Allen of Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts studied the behavior of pendulum before, during, and after solar eclipse. The pair took a slightly different approach to LA, and they used a torsion pendulum, which is a massive disc suspended from a wire attached to its center. Rotating the disc slightly caused the wire to twist. When it is released, the disc continues to twirl first clockwise and then counterclockwise with a fixed period. But during an eclipse, their pendulum speeds up significantly. They concluded that the gravitational theory needs to be modified. In India in 1995, D.C. Mishra and M.B.S. Rao of the National Geophysical Research Institute of Hyderabad observed a small but sudden drop in the strength of gravity when used an extreme accurate gravimeter during a solar eclipse, but results had been mixed. When the eclipsed sun rose above Helsinki on July 22, 1990, Finnish geophysics found no disturbance of the usual swing. Yet in March 1997, scientists observed gravimeter anomalies during an eclipse in a very remote area of the northeast China. The mystery continues, and yet no academic institution appears to be willing time to invest and money to study this phenomenon in depth. However, Thomas Goody, a self-funding independent researcher of Brentford in England, had decided that he would investigate this LA effect by using several pendulums during an eclipse, because the modern equipment is such more accurate and sensitive than available in 1954, giving 20 to 100 times better resolution. He is confident of a clear result. Goody plans to travel the world over the next few years with 12 specially constructed pendulums. In May 2004, he presented his strategy at a meeting at the Society for Scientific Exploration in Las Vegas and invited physicists to join him. As the New Scientist reported, several leaped at the chance. Goody suspects that the anomalies occurred when an observer in a near the line that connects the center of masses of the Sun and the Moon. During a total solar eclipse, the moon line intersects the surface of the Earth at 2 points on roughly opposite sides of the globe. This theory would explain why the sunrise eclipse in Helsinki did not produce a result. Goody is quoted for saying that the observations is anti-eclipse, point that there are no eclipse invisible might carry a much greater weight. We wait with interest to hear the final results of Thomas Goody's experiment. At this point it seems that though we might well have been right to suspect that pendulum reveal a great deal about the nature of our planet's gravity and gravitational relationship with the moon and the sun. Could it be because the moon blocks out the disk of the sun so perfectly it is acting as a shield on an ongoing interaction between the Earth and the sun? Or perhaps it is because that the three senses of mass is lined up in something physical occurs at this time. We also wonder whether the unknown individuals who devised the methylated yard and its inherent geometry understood much more about this pendulum effect than we do. Our previous findings strongly suggest that they knew a great deal more about Earth-Moon-Sun relationship. And then there's a little sub-chapter to that. A special relationship. Our initial findings about methylated geometry described in Civilization 1 has caused us to examine all kinds of unexpected relationships between the Earth and the ancient measures. This has further prompted us to wonder whether the 366 geometry that produced the methylated yard had was in some way planet-specific. Was there some connection between the mass, spin, and solar orbit that made it special to the Earth? First, we applied the principle of the methylated yard geometry to all the planets in the solar system. No discernible pattern emerged. They appeared to be completely random results. For example, Mars produced 19.78 methylated yard per second of arc, and Venus and an unimpressive 347.8. We also checked the major moons of other planets to no avail. A good friend of Chris, Dr. Hilary Newbigin, suggested that furnace we try using the number of days per orbit of each planet to see if there was a relationship to the individual dimensions, but again the results were negatives. Then we looked at Earth's moon. I'm going to have to correct myself here, my sitting position. The result here was anything but meaningless. We took the moon's radius, defined by NASA as being 1,738.100 kilometers, to calculate the circumference of a meaningless sounding 10,920.8 meters. When we then converted this distance into megalithic yard, which gave us an equally apparent arbitrary value of 13,162. We then applied the methylated geometry by dividing this circumference into 366 degrees, 60 minutes and 60 seconds of arc. To our amazement, there were 100 methylated yard per lunar methylated second of arc. The accuracy of the result was 99.9%, which is well within the range of error of this kind of calculation. How strange that the methylated yard is so elegantly lunadetic as well as geodetic. Our next thought was the sun, because we know that the sun is 400 times the size of the moon. It should logically have been a perfect 40,000 methylated yard per second. For thoroughness, we checked that the suns, and it did indeed work perfectly as we expected. This all seemed very odd. The methylated structures that were built across Western Europe were frequently used to observe the movement of the sun and the moon. But how could the unit of measure upon which these structures were based so beautiful integer to the circumference of these bodies as well of the Earth? Is it coincidence? No. On top of all the other strange facts regarding the moon, it becomes rather unrealistic to keep putting everything down to random fluke of nature. Of course, we were well aware that the numbers that we were looking at were only integer when one uses the base 10, and we will deal with that issue later. If it's not a coincidence, then there are only two options. The first is that there's some unknown law of astrophysics at work causing relationships to emerge that was spotted some way by our Stone Age forebears. The other is conscious design. The idea of deliberate design seemed plumb crazy. Common sense would tell us it's wrong. Then we once again considered more wise words from Albert Einstein. Common sense is the collection of prejudices acquired by the age 18. At the age of 18, we, like everyone else, knew that everything in the world was natural. But when we put our prejudice of what can and cannot be to one side and thought laterally about it, the more reasonable it seemed. It was not unreasonable to believe that the stone masons of the Neolithic period were smart enough to measure the polar circumference of the Earth, and they devised a unit of measure that was integer to the planet. Such a feat can be achieved with very simple tools and demonstrated by the ancient Greeks. But could they really have measured the circumference of the moon and the sun, or was this mysterious property of pendulums something to do with it? Most of all, we marveled at the fact that yet again it was the size and position of the moon that revealed that there is an issue to resolve. Okay. So we're going to chapter 3 now. Now it's getting interesting. The origin of the moon. Let me flush my throat for a second. Oh, I'm allowed to. Whew. Yeah, I'm having scotch. I like scotch. Okay. The origin of the moon. The best explanation for the moon is observational error. The moon does not exist. And this is attributed to Irving Shapiro of the Harvard Smithsonian Center of Astrophysics. The one escapable fact about the moon and its orbit, that it orbits the Earth, is up there beaming down on us. But according to everything science knows, it shouldn't be. As we have seen, it is known that people have been more moon-gazing for tens of thousands of years, and our understanding has grown to a point where we now are very confused. The Greeks were great gatherers of knowledge and investigators of the rules of nature. In the 5th century BC, Democritus, who originated the theory that matter was made of invisible units he called atoms. Wow. Back then? Wow. Pretty, what the heck? What's going on here? What? Went to the other end of the scale and suggested that the markings on the moon could be mountains. A little later, Eudoxus and Nidus, who was an astronomer and mathematician, calculated the Saros cycle of eclipses and thereby could predict when they would appear. Around 260 BC, yet another Greek by the same name, by the name of Aristarchus. There's actually a crater on the moon that is named after him, and that's not a crater. That's a gigantic complex, massive complex. You cannot even imagine how big it is. And I can prove that. Okay, devised a method by which he thought he could measure the size of the moon and gauge its distance from the Earth. He never actually achieved it, but a mathematician and astronomer of major importance known as Hipparchus and Rhodus achieved the feat around 100 years later. He used an ingenious technique that was conducted during a solar eclipse. The eclipse in question was the total in Cyan, but only partial in Alexandria, which was some 729 kilometers away. Enlisting the help of like-minded friends, Hipparchus was able to use the known distance from Syene to Alexandria, together with the angular difference of the total and the partial eclipse, to establish the moon's true size and distance from the Earth. At the end of the 1st century AD, Plutarch wrote a short work about the moon, entitled On the Face in the Moon's Orb, where he suggested that the markings on the face of the moon were caused by deep recess to reflect sunlight. He proposed that the moon had mountains, rivers, valleys, and even speculated that people might live there. Not people, but the watchers there. Although a Hindu astronomer, Aryabhata, repeated and confirmed the experiment conducted by Hipparchus as late as 500 AD, Christian authorities of the time maintained a biblical approach to the moon, and only information about our near neighbor that did not contradict the scriptures was countenanced. With the arrival of Christianity, the world entered a dark age where scriptures rather than science was the only permitted guide to human existence. It was a little extreme, to be honest. It was, and a lot of bad things came out of it, but that don't mean that it is not correct and it's not true. We have to deal with scientific facts. That is facts. We have to deal with that. We can't just say, oh, well, if the Bible don't say it, well, then it can't be true. Well, it's not exactly how it works. You need to get a hold of yourself. You can't become too Christian and not realizing there is more between heaven and earth that we understand. Absolutely. The grip of the Church slipped somewhat during the 15th and 16th centuries in the Renaissance, literally meaning rebirth, emerged bringing radical and comprehensive changes to the European culture. The Renaissance brought about the demise of the Middle Ages, and for the first time the values of the modern world made an appearance. The consciousness of cultural rebirth was in itself a characteristic of the Renaissance. Italian scholars and critics of this period proclaim that the age has been progressed beyond the barbarism of the past and had found its inspiration and its closest parallel in the civilization of the ancient Greece and Rome. By the end of the 16th century, a genius from the town Pisa called Galileo Galilei became one of the most important scientists of the Renaissance, carrying out experiments into pendulums, falling weights, the behavior of light, and many other subjects that captures his imagination. Above all, most of his adult life, Galileo was an avid astronomer. In May 1609, Galileo received a letter from Paolo Sapi telling him about the ingenious spyglass that a Dutchman had shown in Venice. Galileo wrote in April 1610, "About 10 months ago a report reached my ears that a certain Fleming," that's the name of my brother, "had constructed a spyglass by means of which visible objects though very distant from the eye of the observer, were distinctly seen as nearby," meaning binoculars, telescope. Of its truly remarkable effects, several experiences were related to which some persons believed, while others denied them. A few days later, the report was confirmed by a letter I received from a Frenchman in Paris, Jacques Berdover, which caused me to apply myself wholeheartedly to investigate means by which I might arrive to the invention of a similar instrument. This I did soon afterwards, my basis being the doctrine of refraction. Okay. From these reports, and by applying his skills as a mathematician and craftsman, Galileo began to make series of telescopes with an optical performance much better than the Dutch instrument. His first telescope was made from available lenses and gave a magnification about 4 times. But to improve on this, Galileo taught himself to grind and polish his own lenses, and by August 1609 he had an instrument with a magnification about 8 or 9. He quickly realized the commercial and military value of his super telescope that he called perspiculum, that's in Italian, particularly for seafaring purposes. As the winter of 1609 brought colder, clearer nights, Galileo turned his telescope towards the night sky and began to make series of truly remarkable discoveries. The astronomical discoveries he made with his telescope were described in a short book called The Starry Messenger, published in Venice in May of the following year, and they caused a sensation. Amongst many findings, Galileo claimed to have proved that the Milky Way was made up of tiny stars, to have seen 4 small moons orbiting Jupiter, and has seen mountains on the moon. As with many of his scientific investigations, Galileo would easily have fallen foul of the church authorities if his drawings of the moon had been made public. According to Christian tradition, both the sun and the moon were perfect, unblemished spheres. They simply had to be because God had created them, and none of the almighty creations could be flawed. Eventually, Galileo was put under perpetual house arrest by the papacy for his blasphemous claim that the sun was the center of the solar system. It is therefore quite possible that he knew more about the moon than he was willing to admit in the public. In order to explain the markings on the moon without treading on toes of the church, a number of ideas were put forward in Christian countries. Perhaps the most popular of these, at least for a while, was the suggestions that the moon was a perfect mirror. If this was the case, there was no markings on the moon, but rather reflections of surface features from the Earth. It didn't seem to occur to anyone that the moon orbited the Earth. The markings should change. Since it had land beneath, it would not remain constant. Another suggestion, and one that was accepted in some circles, was that there was mysterious vapors between the Earth and the moon. The images, it was suggested, were present in sunlight and were merely reflected from the vapors. But the most popular theory, probably because it didn't impinge on Christian doctrine, was that there were variations of the density of the moon, and these created the optical illusion that we see as markings on the moon surface. This unlikely explanation was safe, though it was probably did little to convince the early scientists, and certainly would not have impressed Galileo. After Galileo's time, telescopes improved markedly, and was obvious to anyone who studied the moon that it was a sphere with rocky and undulating surface. As the Church gradually lost its power to direct scientific thoughts of many of the early ideas regarding the moon became unthinkable. But no one had an idea how the moon had come into being and why it occupied the orbit it did around the Earth. It didn't take long for the subject of the moon to become very important to astronomers. Empires such as those created at Britain and France and Spain were expanding. This necessitated long sea voyages and led to the most urgent searches. A way to plot longitudinals at sea. It is quite easy to establish one position on the planet in the north-south line latitude, but it was impossible to know where you were in terms of east and west longitude. In the northern hemisphere, for example, latitude could quickly be gauged by measuring the angular distance between the horizon and the pole star. This angle also defines one position north of the equator. The longitude problem was eventually solved by having an extremely accurate clock on board a ship that was set to the time at one point of departure. It was difficult to work out the difference between local time, say at midday, and the time at home port. It was then simply a matter of adding and subtracting to discover one's true position on the Earth's surface. This was fine, but it took many decades before a suitable, accurate clock could be created. In the meantime, astronomers sought for other methods to determine longitude, not least of all because it was fabulous prize on offer for anyone who would crack the problem. And the plays were many, and of them turned to establish longitude was the moon. Astronomers proposed that really accurate tables were kept of the moon position relative to the background stars. It could be possible to access the true time and day, or assess the true time and day in one home port. The reason this could work was that the moon, being very close to Earth and is orbiting quickly, moved across the heavens by around 13 degrees arc per day. Using the moon, it was a fairly simple matter to establish local time, and then do the necessary computations to discover one's position. The list of tables necessary to accomplish the task were not so simple. However, and as soon as good chronometers were available, the moon was abandoned as a means of longitude assessments. However, the desire to solve this problem and its potential provability of doing so meant that the moon was receiving a great deal of attention during the 17th century, and very accurate maps of its surface began to appear. It wasn't until the 19th century, however, that probability for recent explanation as to the moon's origin was put forward. George Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin, the controversial Englishman who first proposed the theory of natural selection, the theory of evolution, which is hogwash. I mean, DNA in plants, DNA in animals, DNA in especially humans are simply too complex to be a random coincidence of so-called evolution over millions of years. It's simply impossible. You need to go in and look at the gene package of a human species alone, and you will find out that there are billions of puzzle pieces to put together a human being. Billions. And you calling that a chance? No, that's freaking intelligent design. It's perfection. And it all go in synchronicity with the Fibonacci sequence. All of it. All life. You going to bed now? Kisses, girl. So, a known and respected astronomer who studied the moons extensively and came up with what is now known as the fission theory in 1878. George Darwin may have been the first astronomer to ascertain that the moon was moving away from the Earth. Working backwards from his knowledge of the rate of the moon was receding from the Earth, Darwin proposed a time that the Earth and the moon could have been part of the same common mass. He suggested that this molten viscous sphere a viscous sphere, not viscous, but viscous sphere, had been rotating extremely rapidly in about 5.5 hours. Darwin further speculated that the tidal actions of the Sun had caused what he termed a fission, a moon-sized dollop of the molten Earth spinning away from the main mass and eventually taking up station in orbit. At the time, this seemed very reasonable, and it was favored theory in the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, fission theory did not come under serious attack until the 1920s, when a British astronomer called Harold Jeffreys was able to show that the viscosity of the Earth and its semi-molten state would have dampened the motions required to generate the right sort of vibration necessary to fulfill Darwin's fission, splitting up. Fusion is to merge. Fission is splitting, like a nuclear energy. That's fission. You're releasing. A second theory that once convinced a number of experts was the co-creation theory, co-accretion theory. This postulates that the Earth, having already been formed, accumulated a disk of solid particles, a little like the rings of Saturn. It was suggested that the case of the Earth, this disk was particles ultimately came together to form the Moon. Well, if that's the case, the Moon would be porous, meaning if you're stepping on the ground, it would be like quicksand, right? That don't make sense. I mean, it would be like walking on the beach. Don't make sense. Well, that the Earth particles ultimately came together to form the Moon. There are several reasons why this theory can't be the answer. Not least, it's the problem of angular momentum of the Earth-Moon system that could never have been as it is. If the Moon had formed this way, there are difficulties regarding the melting of the magma oceans of an infant Moon. Yeah, that would be... come on. Third theory regarding the origin of the Moon that was in circulation around the time that was the first lunar probes that were launched was the intact capture theory. At one time seeming to be the most attractive possibility, the intact capture theory suggested that the Moon originated far from the Earth and the Moon became a rogue body that was simply captured by the gravitational pull of the Earth, and it took up orbit around the Earth. That sounds insane, because that's not the case. There are many reasons why intact capture theory is now disregarded. Oxygen isotopes on the rock of the Moon and on the Earth prove conclusively that they have originated at the same distance from the Sun, which could not be the case if the Moon had been formed elsewhere. There is also insurmountable problems in trying to build a model that would allow a body to be big as the Moon to take up orbit around the Earth. Such a huge object could not simply drift neatly into an Earth orbit at low speed like carefully docking a supertanker. It would almost certainly smash into Earth at a massive speed and possibly skim off and hurtle onwards. That's my theory too. This is hogwash, that some big object hit the Earth and flung off a piece, and it got so hot and it coalesced and bling, it became the Moon. You heard that story. That's hogwash. That's simply unthinkable. By the 1970s, all previous theories about the way that the Moon had been formed were running into trouble for one reason and another, and this created a virtually unthinkable situation in which acclaimed expert might have to stand up in public, admit that they simply didn't know how or why the Moon was there. As acclaimed scientist, writer, William K. Hartman, senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute, Tucson, Arizona, said in 1986 in his book Origin of the Moon, neither the Apollo astronauts, the lunar vehicle, nor all the king's horses and all the king's men could assemble enough data to explain the circumstances of the moon's birth. Exactly. Out of this miasma came a new theory, and in fact the only one that is presently widely accepted despite some fundamental problems. It is known as the Big Whack theory. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was just referring to. Something ran into the Earth and pulled off a big chunk and then, coalesced and became the moon. The idea came out of theories that originated from the Soviet Union in the 1960s, specifically the works of the Russian scientist V.S. Savronov, who had been working on the possibility of planetary origins from the literal millions of different sized asteroids known as planetesimals. What? Okay. As divergence from the Soviet ideas, Hartmann, together with a colleague D.R. Davis, suggested that the moon had come into being as a result of a collision of two planetary bodies, one being Earth and the other a rogue planet at least as large as planet Mars. Hartmann and Davis hypothesized that the two planets had collided in a specific way that allowed jets of matter to be ejected from the mantles of both bodies. This matter was thrown into orbit, where it eventually came together to form the moon. That just sounds stupid. The suggestion seemed to have many merits. First and foremost, it appears to address the greatest puzzle that recovery of moon rocks had thrown up. How was it that the composition of the moon was so similar to Earth, but only in part? A close analysis of the moon rock had shown that it is very similar to the rock forms in the mantle of the Earth, yet the moon is now nowhere near as massive as the Earth in proportional terms. The Earth is only 3.66 times as big as the moon. There you have it again, 366. What the heck is going on here? Good heavens. But has 81 times more the moon's mass. It is obvious that the moon could not contain many of the heavy elements that are found inside the Earth, and the Big Whack theory purported to explain why this was the case. The Earth and the rogue visitor had come together in a specific way. Although they would eventually form one planet, it was reasoned that they must have been impacted, drawn apart, and then come together again. Computer modeling showed that under these very special circumstances it would have been possible for material thrown off to have been mantle material from close to the surface of the two bodies. Although the theory eventually gained ground, at first it seemed so improbable that it was generally rejected. But with the passing of time, further work showed that such unlikely scenario could conceivably have taken place. In 1983, an international conference held in Kona, Hawaii. Gosh, man. Talk too much, right? Tried to solve the problem regarding the origins of the moon. It was at this meeting that the Big Whack theory, also known as the giant impact hypothesis of the collision ejection theory, began to gain ground. Hartmann's own suggestion, together with those other scientists at the conference, formed the nucleus of the 1986 book Origin of the Moon, which were edited by Hartmann himself. In the intervening period, several experts had created computer models that purport to add weight to the Big Whack theory, and most convincing of these are those of Dr. Robin Kemner, who is now Assistant Director of the Department of Space Studies in Colorado, USA. Kemner wrote her PhD dissertation of the moon origin, and specifically the Big Whack theory. Her early work led to the conclusion that the suggested impact would have actually led to a swarm of moonlets rather than the moon. That's what I'm thinking too. If that's the case, there would be a bunch of rocks flying around us. Well, we do have asteroids, but it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about big chunks of Earth floating around us in a fixed orbit, just like satellites. That would be, it don't make sense. Rather than the moon, but by 1997, further computer modeling resulting in a model of the impact that would lead to the moon's presence. Despite the fact that the Big Whack theory is now generally accepted by most authorities, it has many problems. Not least of all, it's not recognized by Robin Kemner herself, as she admits that there are one key aspect of this theory that doesn't make sense. This stems from the fact that other researchers has pointed out that such a massive impact as proposed could not have failed to speed up the rotation of the Earth to a level far beyond today's situation. Kemner agrees that the only way she could deal with this anomaly is to propose a second major impact. Oh gosh, a double whack. Okay, one whack is not enough. We come back and then we smack it again, right? Yeah. You see, this sounds ridiculous. Oh man, this is stupid. This suggests that the second planetary collision happened perhaps only a few thousand years after the first one, but quite incredibly. This incoming object came from the opposite direction, so it cancelled out the huge spin imparted to the Earth by the first cataclysmic event. Okay, here I have to stop. 5,000 years ago, the ancient Sumerians calculated to the T, 99.9% accuracy, the size, the daytime, everything. Okay? They did that. So, with that precision that we have here, the methylical yard 2, first an object comes in and hit Earth, and the Earth is spinning faster and faster and faster because of that, right? It's set in motion. And then it comes back again, the double whack, right? And hit the Earth from the opposite direction and slows the Earth rotation down to a perfect rotation of the 366. You can see that's a problem. That's simply not possible. And on the other hand, if you look realistically on it, if this kind of whack had taken place, it would be our night sky will look different, and our daytime sky too, because we will have these big gigantic rocks floating around out there, chunks that is chipped off and never collected or landed back on the Earth or on the moon itself, and forming perfect spheres again. No, I can't subscribe to that. That's ridiculous. There would be a giant scar like a bite of an apple on the surface of the planet, and that's not the case. Okay, we can say the Pacific Ocean is a big gouge in the Earth's surface, but that's not why the Pacific Ocean is there. The Earth has grown in size. Land parted from each other, which is called tectonics. So, okay, where are we here? Okay, so it cancelled out the huge spin imparted to the Earth by the first cataclysmic event. which would have been made life on Earth an impossibility, because the heat would be so extensive that everything that was perhaps evolutionary forming would have been vaporized instantly by the heat wave, the shock wave. Not possible. Well, this balanced double act sound unlikely in the extreme. Two cosmic collisions that just happen to precisely return the planet into its natural rhythm. It's just what I'm saying. Oh well. To us, this explanation smacks of desperation. Kemner herself is not happy with the Big Whack too, and is hopeful of modifying the original theory so it can account for the present rate of spin of the Earth. I mean, come on. There's some bigger things at play here, such as God. There's another big problem to overcome if the Big Whack theory is to be taken seriously. When rocks were brought back from the moon, both by American astronauts and the Soviet unmanned moon missions, they were subjected to every conceivable test. The observed fact that put paid to be captured asteroid theory of the moon is actually a gigantic stumbling block on the Big Whack theory. It has been observed that the oxygen isotope signatures of the moon rocks are identical with the rocks from the Earth. That fact has some serious implications. Moon rocks and Earth rocks can only have the same oxygen isotope signature if they originated from the same distance from the Sun. This would mean that the Mars-sized body that hit the Earth must have occupied a similar orbit to that of the Earth, and yet already managed to survive for many millions of years before it hit Earth. That don't sound reasonable. No. This situation is extremely unlikely, and it throws up other difficulties. The present obliquity of the Earth is 20 degrees tilt against the plane of its orbit of the Sun. It is usually deemed to be the result of a giant impact. But another body of that size of mass that would have in an orbit similar to the Earth could not have had sufficient momentum to knock the Earth's angle of rotation back so severely. Either the rogue planet was Mars-sized and came from way out in the solar system and was therefore traveling extremely fast, or else it had been at least 3 times the size of Mars, which doesn't tie it with the computer models as they stand. Some of the other problems were cited by Jack Lissauer, a well-respected scientist of NASA's Ames Research Center, in an article he wrote for Nature in 1997. Lissauer is said to have joked to his students about a remark made by another scientist, Irvin Shapiro, from the Harvard Smithsonian Center of Astrophysics. The best explanation for the moon is observational error. The moon does not exist. Lissauer's article pointed out some of the problems with the Big Whack theory. He made it clear that in his opinion the latest research demonstrated that much of the material blown off by the impact, the ejecta, would have fallen back to Earth, he says. The implications here is that the lunar growth in an impact-produced disk is not very efficient. So to form our moon, more material must be placed in orbit at a greater distance from Earth than previously believed. Lissauer made it clear that as a result, he too is of the opinion that the rogue planet must have been substantially larger than the original proposed, but noted that it is difficult to see how this excess angular momentum resulting in such a large impact could have been lost. The other scientists, Ruzicka, Snyder, and Taylor, approached the problem from a slightly different direction by analyzing the biochemical data available against the theoretical Big Whack. After
A detailed examination, they concluded there are no strong geochemical support for either a giant impact or impact-triggered fission hypothesis. These words used in the conclusion of this biochemical analysis indicate just how hopelessly contrived the whole Big Whack theory is. They go on to say this hypothesis has arisen not so much because of its merits of its theory as because of the apparent dynamical and geochemical shortcomings of other theories. In other words, scientists hang on to the Big Whack theory, even though it has more holes than a rusty colander, simply because no other logical explanation has been found. It is just the least impossible explanation for a celestial body that has no right to be there. Not only is the Big Whack theory discredited on a number of grounds by the scientific fraternity itself, it is also singularity fails to deal with the anomalies thrown up by our own research, as outlined throughout this book. Big Whack cannot explain the extraordinary relationship between the moon and the sun, or the moon and the Earth. The moon could, by pure chance, end up being exactly 1/400th the size of the sun, and occupying an orbit that allows it to stand 1 to 400 the distance between the Earth and the sun. But the odds are quite literally astronomical against it. The moon is proportionally bigger in relation to its host planet than any other planet in the solar system apart from the Charon, Pluto's moon, which is half the size diameter of Pluto. Question is Pluto really a planet? Or is it something that is thrown off because of PlanetX, sucked out of, let's say, Uranus orbit and placed out there in a very non-equatorial ecliptic orbit around the sun? It is actually 17 degrees off the ecliptic. So I'm not sure Pluto is a planet. I believe, that's just my belief, that Pluto is either a moon of Uranus which has been dragged out of its orbit because of PlanetX passing. That's possible. PlanetX has caused Earth tilting by 26 degrees, so why should it not be possible for a tiny little bit of rock the size of Pluto to be dragged out of its orbit completely, out of Uranus' grip? That's possible. Absolutely. Pluto is not a planet. It's a moon from another object. Maybe not Uranus, but something. It came from somewhere else. Because it doesn't fit, because all the other planets are on the ecliptic in orbit around the sun, except Pluto. It's way off. Okay. Pluto's moon, which is more than half the diameter of Pluto. These two bodies are essential twin planets, or maybe asteroids orbiting each other at close range, although they are believed to have an unrelated origin. Well, you never know. It's just funny, they're spherical, right? Asteroids are not spherical. They're just big chunks of rocks. Okay, Mercury has no moons at all. Neither has Venus. Mars does have 2 moons, but they are very tiny in comparison with our own. A close examination of many samples of moon rocks brought back from the American Apollo missions and the Soviet unmanned missions has thrown up what turned out to be one of the biggest surprises of all. It has been observed that the oldest of rocks collected from the moon are significantly more ancient than any rock ever found on Earth, suggesting that the moon is bloody older than Earth. The most venerable rocks to be found on the Earth date back 3.5 billion years, Will some samples from the moon around 4.5 billion years old? Well, we're talking 1 billion years difference. That's freaking a lot of time. Which is very close to the estimated age of our solar system. When radioactive dating techniques are applied to the meteorites, they are uniformly found to be 4.6 billion years old. Yet even those rocks have the same oxygen isotope signature as those on Earth, another indication that the moon has occupied its present distance from the Sun for an incredibly long time. There is currently no persuasive argument for state of affairs. Our own almost accidental discoveries regarding the peculiar ratio relationship between the Earth, the Moon, and Sun described in our previous book, Civilization 1, led us to an in-depth appraisal of the latest theories regarding the Moon and its origins. We were stunned by what we discovered. The Moon is bigger than it should be, apparently older than it should be, and much lighter in mass than it should be. It occupies an unlikely orbit and is so extraordinary that all existing explanations for its presence is fraught with difficulties, and none of them could be considered remotely watertight. We came to realize that many reputable experts across the world have significant misgiving about the current theories concerning the Moon's origin that we have shown in this chapter. They are quite willing to voice publicly. No matter how much the advocates for the Big Bang theory may claim they have solved the puzzle, that the Moon is quite obvious that it claims to be far from being true. The Moon remains, to borrow the words of Winston Churchill, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Okie dokie. That was 2 chapters. So far, so good. I don't know, should I check one more? It's regarding walking on the Moon. Okay, this is kind of extensive, and it's bloody getting late. So, yeah, this one is long. Let's just say this 20 pages plus comments from me. So I'm gonna stop it here, and then I will continue. That will be tomorrow. I'll definitely take Walking on the Moon chapter, and this is We Chose to Go to the Moon, the quote from John F. Kennedy on September 12, 1962. So I'm going to take that tomorrow, if you are okay with that. So for now, over and out, and God bless you.